Okay, well, welcome back to Ryan Abbott, Professor Emeritus, author of The Reasonable Robot, and you've met him before, the proponent of all the Darbus cases, and James Tunbridge, Common Councillor for the City of London, and more importantly, I suppose, to this context, a partner at Keystone Law, a specialist in IP, and myself, Christian Gordon-Pullar. I've done many things, in-house IP, but mostly around IP strategy and creating value around intellectual property. But today we're talking about governance and the international action. I suppose in light of, let's say, a difference of opinion. In China and the East, the idea of innovation and creativity for patents and IP in 1997 was relatively basic, and patent damages were $37,700, which basically meant that a lot of people were not discouraged from infringing IP rights. And now, of course, all of that has changed. China and its companies are some of the greatest patent and IP filers in the world. So in the East, we have a shift in the approach towards valuing and appreciating the value of IP. Perhaps in the West now, with the advent of technology and AI, we've seen a lot of newspapers, news media, individuals, musicians, Elton John, Paul McCartney, all come to the fore and argue that content rights and content creators' rights should be respected in the training of artificial intelligence systems, and therefore reflecting that perhaps somewhere in the West, the idea that laws are not fit for purpose seems to be mismatching the East, where laws now seem to be recognizing the value of IP created by human beings and artificial intelligence. And those two differences of governance and international approaches is what we're talking about today. So to James and
because I have a very different view on why does the East do what you've just described.
Okay.
So I'm sure the people listening to podcasts today, for the most part, will be too young to be aware that actually there was a period of time in the 60s when Japan was seen as China had been seen, that they were lovingly ripping off great things until Japanese companies began to improve and create their own inventions. And then economically, those corporations and the Japanese government really wanted intellectual property to work. And they went from being the world's knockoff joint to one of the great innovators. And in the 1980s, in the West, we enjoyed a lot of Japanese invented and Japanese created electronics. Now, China is just on a different journey, a little bit behind them. And, China is the world's factory, been producing all sorts of goods. As they have moved from simply making goods for other people, perhaps designed in the West, to developing their own, they've gone on their own journey, being more interested. And I think that's what you're seeing. And then in the West, I think the answer to the point you've just talked about is more to do with the fact that we have had a system, not always a perfect system, of rewarding creativity. And particularly in the copyright arts space, it's not always understood that whilst you've got the odd enormous company like Disney that has a lot of copyrighted material, and some very wealthy individuals like J.K. Rowling that have had really successful books, the vast majority of songs, books, periodicals, etc., are sort of jobbing creators that don't tend to enjoy that huge success. And therefore, they are living off their creativity. And if we ignore that, will we lose from the ecosystem of creative people a lot of people? And I think that's the sort of the fight on the training side, because I'll finish on this point. I mean, I just recently finished writing something about this, that millions of sort of documents and books were used in early ChatGPT. It's down to billions, and it's the size of these data sets that's creating that tension, because where are you going to find tomorrow's books if we don't create them?
That's really interesting. And also, so moving on to that sort of point about an approach going forward, a sort of unified AI IP framework, obviously harmonization post TRIPS, Ryan, TRIPS, and the exit by the United States from TRIPS has had a lot of consequences. But also recently, the push towards recognizing the need for AI adoption also then means there are lots of other consequences. There's compute, there's data centers, there's power, there's energy, and so on. And that ecosystem grows, as you were saying in the last podcast, perhaps to the benefit of some. How do we try to harmonize the approach between what technology companies need to innovate, and clearly they are a huge driver of the current economies across the world, versus content creators, the, let's call them the old world, of who actually created content on which these technology giants are standing on the shoulders of perhaps historically smaller, but nonetheless giants of content creation.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there's a lot of good reasons to have an internationally harmonized AI and IP regime, including because so much of it is, non-jurisdictional technologically and access-wise. And given the kind of intangible nature of, creative works, going to be very difficult for a lot of reasons. I mean, finding multilateral agreement these days is hard to come by. But I think more importantly than that, you're not going to get multilateral agreement when each jurisdiction doesn't even know what it wants, right? There's no jurisdiction to me that has really said, we figured this whole AI and IP thing out. Here's what we want. Let's go try and get everyone else to agree with it. If you look at the United States, there are right now more than 50 lawsuits going on accusing AI developers of committing copyright infringement for training machine learning based systems on creative works, right? The first one of these that settled last month, though some have been dismissed, settled for $1.5 billion. A judge there found that it was totally fair use for them to have trained on protected works, but that the way they did it was improper because they downloaded known pirated copies of books and they kept them indefinitely on their servers. Meanwhile, one of the others is up in the Third Circuit on appeal because first the judge found it was fair use, then the judge found it wasn't fair use, and he allowed an appeal on it. A third one was a very long treatise from a judge saying that he thought it shouldn't have been fair use, but it was fair use. So you don't even have courts agreeing in the United States about whether you are legally allowed to train on copyright protected works. In the meantime, we talked a bit about how law lags technology, and it's crazy to me that like anyone could have seen this coming or should have seen this coming, but no one was dealing with it until it's already here. All these systems are trained. There's, billions of dollars or higher in price tags associated with some outcomes in these cases. Businesses don't know what to do, but in the meantime, developers are just, doing what they think they need to do. So step one in having an internationally harmonized regime is coming up with a domestic regime for this and thinking about, well, what do we want? Do we want it to be copyright infringement to train on works? Do we want it to be fair use to train on works? Do we want to have some sort of middle ground where we have a compulsory licensing regime or a collecting rights organization and some payment to content creators to encourage all that they've done? These are discussions that should have been had 5 or 10 years ago. And so that we should be having them now. And I think they really are more a matter for policymakers than courts to try and figure out, well, how do we take laws written decades ago and maybe shoehorn this stuff in there?
I think that's very interesting. And I think perhaps just to sort of close off, we know that whatever happens, it's going to happen somewhere first. And what we're trying to do is to harmonize sufficiently. Why are we trying to do that? So that both international companies and people creating for an international context don't start forum shopping. Why? Because everyone wants people to forum shop where they are, which is why historically Ireland created lots of incentives for companies to come in, which incentives benefited everyone for a few years, and then of course, companies forum shop and continue to go. One of the benefits of harmonization is that you prevent that happening. And in fact, you create an ecosystem that builds everyone equally rather than people serially. But the flip side is that's always going to happen. There's going to be people who want there to be zero regulations. I think you might have seen that in your Darbus case in South Africa. When I read that, I thought to myself, South Africa really wants people to come to South Africa. When I read the conclusion of that hearing, some countries will be motivated by promoting their own country. But James, do you think that, have you seen from a London perspective, from an England perspective, that meeting point between the US views and what England is trying to do, the UK is trying to do, marrying views across Europe to try and be the bridge between the two?
No, we're not. Good luck assuming that we have a view officially. There was a view. The current British government would like you to think they have a view on everything, but they don't. And America's view and continental European view rather different. There's some wonderful images, Venn diagram type things, suggesting that America is looking for just business innovation and Europe likes to be the first to regulate, and where they overlap is not always a pleasant experience. But I think to what you said, the most interesting point that hasn't been factored in there is people, Christian, because you were talking about countries, you were talking about governments, you were talking about the utopian view that if we were one planet, you wouldn't have forum shopping. But the thing is that governments exist to look after people, and people have different interests and views and needs. And culturally, we don't have the same views around the world. So that's where some of that's quite difficult. And that's why I think harmonization works well in some areas, particularly sort of international travel, maritime and shipping and aviation. You need certain common rules because they are working everywhere. But you're going to struggle. I think it comes back to what Ryan said. You've got to work out, what do you think works for your community first? And then do you have common ground with other communities? But good luck if you want to come up with one thing that everyone will say, yes, please, because there'll be somebody somewhere looking at their domestic base saying, well, actually, I'm elected by these people and they don't like that.
Well, since all of us practice, and just to sort of close off, conscious that we could definitely discuss this one for a very long time, conscious that, Ryan, you practice in the UK as well and teach here, and James and I are both here. It might be interesting. Last night I was at dinner with someone whose son was working for Harvey AI. Harvey AI being the AI that the government has disclosed that it signed up to and uses. And James, I just would be very happy if we, as a country, could come to some conclusion on the AI and copyright consultation, which started in November last year and closed in February this year, but still, and we're in October, hasn't seen any conclusions. And I'll make you laugh, I hope, with the understanding that one of the reasons for that is that they forgot to ask consent for all of the consultant submissions for AI to summarize their feedback, which is ridiculous since the topic heading was copyright and AI. And as a result, when they received 11,600 submissions, they have to do that manually. And that might explain why we don't have the conclusions of the consultation. But with that, I would really say that I hope for much better in the future than we've done in the past.
Thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thank you, James. Brian, final thoughts?
No, that I couldn't top that ending note, but
thank you again to James Tunbridge and Ryan Abbott. This is me, Christian Gordon-Pullar, and we'll leave you for the next time. See you again.